All right, we are back on the show, everyone. John Pollock here alongside Cody Saftik. It's a real pleasure to be joined on the line by Erik Magraken. He is a litigation lawyer, no stranger to Fight Network, because with the announcement of the Mixed Martial Arts Athletes Association, myself and Cody both agreed we need someone to educate us and know exactly what they're talking about. So, Erik, we greatly appreciate you joining us today on the show.
Yeah, John, thanks for having me on.
Well, first of all, Erik, I mean, I'm sure you listened to this conference call much like us. And listening to this from a legal perspective, what were some of your kind of big picture takeaways from the announcement of this association and some of the key players involved as well?
Yeah, the biggest takeaway I had, and I didn't listen to it live, I wasn't on the call, but I was watching all of the media's live tweets on this, along with a lot of fighters' reactions. And my initial takeaway, unlike when the PFA was announced, and unlike when the MMAFA was announced and has been plugging away for almost a decade, having these big-name fighters at the forefront of the conference, I think, really resonated with a lot of people. When you have GSP, Donald Cerrone, all these recognizable fighters putting their name on this, putting their brand on this, putting their public face out there for scrutiny from Zuffa and willing to take on the repercussions. Lots of fighters were very quickly tweeting, hey, I'm on board, contact me, I want to talk to you guys. And it looks like this is maybe the biggest splash that I've seen to date of fighters trying to organize. So I think as an initial move, this was a very important announcement. And with the involvement of James Quinn, that's the lawyer from New York that GSP hired to duke out his contract dispute with the UFC, he's very well versed in U.S. labor law. So with the involvement of him behind the scenes, I think this organization probably has the right tools in their arsenal to try to affect some change.
It's interesting because, yeah, that name was brought up, and I almost think that it would have been met with almost unanimous support if you had him on the line as well to all of this, because it seems that the most polarizing figure, without any question, is Bjorn Rebney and his involvement here.
Yeah, and so he's apparently involved as an advisor. He was mentioning he doesn't have any voting authority, and it's basically an organization of the fighters for the fighters, and they are the ones that make the decision. But you really do have to question why he's involved, what role he's playing, and if he's an advisor and you have a guy like James Quinn on retainer, why do you need Bjorn Rebney, particularly given how polarizing he is? The one question I had, and a lot of media figures had as well, is who's financing all of this? Bjorn was dodging those questions. He said the CAA was not financing. I think he expressly said that, but when pressed on who was, he wouldn't give a straight answer. And I think that I think that's a real issue because Bjorn is polarizing, and you don't know who's pulling the financial strings on this venture or why they're pulling the financial strings on this venture. And I think that should create some hesitation. What I'd like to see is transparency on that front. And the other thing I think the fighters would really benefit from is if these vying, organizing movements, the MMAA, MMAFA, PFA, if they could just all get on the same page, because it's enough of a barrier for fighters in this culture of fear that Zuffa has created over the years with how they do business and some of their heavy-handed tactics. It's enough of a barrier for fighters to want to come forward and organize in the first place. But when they're faced with the decision of who do you get on board with these vying organizations, I think that's really troubling, and that's working against the greater goal of organization. So I'd really, more than anything, like to see transparency of who's behind all of this and getting all these guys on the same page to make fighters' choices easy to get on board.
Hey, Erik, Cody here. Just wanted to get your thoughts on, as you mentioned, there's obviously different organizations popping up, and they all have similar goals but not the same goals. Now we see with the introduction of the MMAA, basically the Fighter Association, do you think this is the most promising organization to come out to date? Do they have potentially the best chance of pulling this off? As you mentioned, you're very happy that they were able to get big-name fighters behind them, but do they pose something that maybe some of these organizations didn't or weren't able to do?
Yeah, again, it's tough to say in these initial stages, but I'll repeat what really jumped out at me, which are two things. One, they've got a well-versed, heavy-hitting lawyer in the mix, which is really key in terms of strategizing how to pull this thing off. And second, having the big-name fighters, unlike when the PFA came forward and they had basically a labor lawyer and a baseball agent at the press conference, they didn't have the backing of a lot of fighters. When you put these relevant, current, big-name UFC fighters out there, you get a quick reaction. People say, look, if GSP is willing to stand up, or if Kane is willing to stand up, or if Donald's willing to stand up, or TJ is there, all these guys putting their neck on the line, I think this organization has the biggest chance of gaining momentum. And the other thing is simply timing. There seems to be, with the changing of the guard of Zuffa ownership, there seems to be very vocal dissension in the ranks. You get guys like Conor McGregor blazing new paths all the time and disrupting the old business practices. I think the timing really benefits the MMAA's chances. But again, I'd like to see them work with these other organizations. I think the best shot is if they pool all of the resources together, because at the end of the day, any of these labor organizations, it's not about the pioneers. It's not about Rob Mazy or Lucas Middlebrook or Jeff Boris or James Quinn or Bjorn Rebney. It's about the fighters, right? And so whoever sets these organizations up, at the end of the day, they're replaceable. It's the fighters are going to be casting their own votes. And so if people set their egos aside and set their personal agendas aside and truly just want to change the landscape for the betterment of the fighters and get on the same page, I think that is when you have the best shot to really affect meaningful change. When there's infighting amongst these organizations, it gets fragmented. It's sort of a divide and conquer mentality. Because you think of it this way: if you're the UFC, and let's just pretend for a moment they in good faith want to deal with all of these fighters and with these organizations, who do you even call? Do you call up Rob or do you call up Bjorn? And what power do these organizations have to represent all of the fighters? Until they get strength in numbers and the real backing of everybody behind one main force, the fragmentation just won't achieve anything.
Now, they also made the clear distinction right off the bat that they are forming an association, given these are independent contractors, as opposed to a union, which, I mean, the way Bjorn Rebney categorized it, that would eat up a lot of time. But looking at the bigger picture of the ultimate goals of this industry and the fighters involved, Erik, is a union something that would have more repercussions, more benefits long-term for the fighters than this? Or can they achieve what they need through this association, in your opinion?
Yeah, this is where it gets a little bit legally complex, and I'll have to confess I'm not deeply versed in U.S. labor relations law, but just in terms of a surface-level understanding, an association doesn't enjoy all of the protections that a union enjoys. So, when it comes to organizing, having strikes, work stoppages, all those kinds of things, there could be repercussions for those actions that aren't protected by law if this group is not a union. And where it becomes legally troubling is if you enter the world of collusion. So if you get a whole bunch of independent contractors basically saying we're going to hold firm and we're going to make demands that we want 50%, you could be facing things like price-fixing allegations. And that's why it's really important to have a guy like James Quinn in the background giving this organization the okay with whatever strategies they have. But if you listen deep into that press conference, at the very end, the last 5 or 10 minutes or so, Bjorn Rebney basically flip-flops a little bit on it and says that becoming a union isn't out of the question. When you look at how the labor organizations in the major sports, NHL, NFL, NBA, baseball, if you look at how all of them have formed, basically the leagues end up being termed monopolies. And they're then given antitrust exemptions. So they're allowed to have this monopoly, but they have to deal with their roster of independent contractors. They have to collectively bargain with them in order to enjoy that antitrust exemption. And so if you follow the NFL labor history, for example, those guys would be a union, and then they would decertify so they could have access to the courts and they could sue the NFL, and then they would kill the union and become the association again and then collectively bargain that way. So it is legally complex, and I don't think the MMAA's statement that they're an association, not a union, is set in stone. I think there is going to be flexibility on that. It's just a matter of what the long game is. But again, there is fragmentation because Bjorn was basically talking dismissively about the MMAFA's class action lawsuit, saying it's way too early to have antitrust litigation going on right now, and he implied that that's maybe a back-end strategy. So it really looks like there's just a lot of competing minds and competing forces in terms of how to best organize these guys. But the one thing that I think almost everybody could agree with is the fighters deserve a bigger piece of the pie, and hopefully they figure out themselves the best way to get this done, because they really are being shortchanged in terms of how much revenue they bring in under the UFC umbrella compared to how little they take out of it, and with how much they put on the line from a health and safety perspective. If any athletes deserve an equitable piece of the pie, it's got to be pro MMA fighters.
I don't think there's anybody disagreeing that fighters should definitely get a higher share of the revenue coming back and something that's owed to them. But in your personal opinion, what would be the realistic time frame on something like this? I know a lot of casual fans, they hear this big news and they get really excited for, well, is this going to happen right away? Oftentimes with law and labor laws, and you're going to have to get all these attorneys involved, it's just a drawn-out process. Now, Bjorn Rebney had mentioned on that conference call that they're not looking to take that long route, but at the same time, he was very vague in what their approach is and what their strategy was, often saying, we've been working for the last 2 years for this strategy, but we're not willing to delve right away. Is this something that's realistic that we could see change as soon as a year or two, or is this something that's really going to be a drawn-out process that could take 3 to 5 years before we see something firmly in place?
Well, look at Rob's efforts. He's been at it for the better part of a decade, and nothing concrete has been achieved. And I'm not casting any dispersions towards Rob. He's working hard and his heart's in the right place, but he still hasn't succeeded in organizing the fighters. So who knows how long it's going to take. My quick takeaway is really twofold. One, there's strength in numbers, and two, there's strength in key fighters. So a guy like GSP, particularly if GSP did this, say, 3 years ago before he took his hiatus, that would have been a very powerful development. What if you get Conor McGregor on board? What if you get a couple of their leading pay-per-view sales? You guys know this as well as anybody. There's only a handful of athletes that drive the UFC's pay-per-view sales. Many of the others are replaceable cogs in the machine when it comes to the money side of the business. If you get those right key players on board, I think you could have change happen very, very quickly. If, on the other hand, support sputters and slowly grows, I don't think there's going to be any change anytime soon, because there's no pressure without the numbers on the UFC to address things.
And that's where I think we stand at this moment, Eric, is that if you're the UFC and you're looking at this announcement, I mean, they've largely walked away from George at this point and having an outstanding year on pay-per-view. The other 4 fighters involved are all going to be fighting under their regular deals for the UFC over the next month. And to me, it really does come down to a Conor McGregor figure attaching his name to this, where that really does put the UFC's feet to the fire, because I don't know if that's the case today, if the UFC is any different a business today than it was yesterday.
And you know what's really fascinating? The announcement of Conor McGregor last night. His camp announced, I think Ariel Helwani broke the story.
Yes.
He has a professional boxing license in California. This is an interesting legal strategy by him, because now that he's a licensed professional boxer, he can claim the protection of the U.S. Muhammad Ali Act. That gives significant protection to boxers that MMA fighters don't enjoy. And here's, if I had to guess, I could be wrong, but if I had to guess, what McGregor's up to is very high-stakes posturing with the UFC. And I don't know if he's going to get on board with this organization or not, but McGregor certainly is happy to disrupt the UFC's practices. He's looking out for himself. The McGregor game plan here might be to say, I am now a pro boxer. My contract cannot go against the Muhammad Ali Act, and to the extent that the UFC contract that he has prevents him from being a professional boxer, he might try to sneak the Muhammad Ali Act protections through the back door there, and that's, it's a great poker move on his part, basically saying to UFC, look, either give me a new deal or we're going to let this thing play out in court. And McGregor announced he's happy to sit on the sidelines until his son or daughter is born. So he's saying, look, I'm shelved for half a year anyways. That's a great time to get a lawyer on board and make some trouble. So if you get a disruptor like McGregor behind this organization, I think it's a brand new ballgame.
To me, Conor McGregor is the ultimate key to this, and his influence, as huge as it is now, could be that much more in 2017, where he could make significant changes to the industry for eternity if he so chooses to put his weight behind this. It's a fascinating topic. You can follow more with Erik at combatsportslaw.com. He's going to be discussing this story. He's got a piece up on the Conor McGregor boxing story as well. And Erik, I want to thank you so much. I know we have a lot of questions coming out of the conference call earlier this week, and I appreciate you shedding some light on it for us.
Yeah, John, Cody, thanks so much for having me on anytime. Always happy to chat legalities with you folks.
Appreciate it. There will be lots to come, I am sure. Thanks, Erik.
Yeah.